All right, my next question, Pastor Steve, is from Chris online. Chris, I'm paraphrasing your question because I can't type all that out, man. But he says, what about the verse that we should not forsake ourselves assembling together? And then he talks about, obviously, we're in a governmented mandate right now. Depending on how long that goes on, and then we've already talked about how the seriousness of that could be one way or the other, do we obey man's law versus Scripture in meeting together as a fellowship? And to add to Christopher's question, there's already been pastors who have taken the stance and met together in certain cities and have literally been arrested for disobeying the order to socially distance themselves. So what do you say, Chris, in that regard?
Well, obviously, Chris, we're doing online studies and that kind of thing, and so there's a balance between the whole command to fellowship and obeying ordinances, every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. And so when I'm looking, this is my thinking on the whole thing, and so I'm not putting this on everybody else. I don't mind the situation right now with doing online studies. I don't really like it. I would rather be meeting here. But you know what? I don't want to take away from the opportunity to be able to share the gospel. I think that when we make these kinds of decisions, we have to be thinking about what the fruit of it's going to be. And I'm not afraid to stand up to anybody. So that's not the issue. The issue is, am I going to be more effective in my witness for Christ if I make a big to-do about closing down for a couple of weeks? Or am I going to be more effective if I obey, again, man's ordinances and just use this as an opportunity to reach even more? I don't know. Well, I get reports on what's happening on online studies and that kind of thing, and we're actually reaching way more people than we usually do in our church services. And so that's a cool thing. But this can't go on forever. And it's going to come to a point where, if they just decide, one of the things, I know I'm going all over the place here because my mind goes all over the place, but one of the things that's happening with this is the church is being impacted specifically. They don't want us meeting together. There is no other thing that goes on like church on Sundays and Wednesdays and Sunday nights in the United States. We don't have meetings. The rest of the people in the United States do not have meetings like we have. And so, there's some incidental things that go on, and so you have social clubs and that kind of stuff. Nothing like the church. And so as soon as I'm looking at this and I start seeing it as being something where they just, they're not interested in a health emergency, they're interested in closing down the church, yeah, they can, we're going to do whatever we please. But right at this point, I think that the requests that they're making are reasonable, in the sense that they're worried about this whole thing being passed around, and whether you believe it or not, as far as the warnings and stuff, I'm of a different mind on this whole thing, and I try to keep up to up to snuff basically on what's actually going on. But whether you think that this is going to be something that kills 100,000 people, or whether you think it's going to be in the United States is what I'm talking about, or whether you think it's going to be something that just kills a few thousand people, still what they're trying to do is they're trying to stop a disease, and I don't want to just be obstinate, because that's what I am anyway. I don't want to just be obstinate. So, they say, hey, could you please shut it down and just for a few weeks and do that? It's like, okay, we can do online stuff. But as soon as it becomes obvious that that there's another agenda in place, then absolutely not. We may not be able to do it openly, in the sense of, it may come to that. That's what's going to happen under persecution. We may not be able to do things openly, but the early church met in homes, and they met quietly, and they had signals that they used to identify each other. The Christian fish. It's like a little fish symbol. You know where that came from? It was a symbol that they used to identify each other. You'd be sitting there talking to somebody that you thought was a Christian, and it's during times of persecution. You just make a little arc in the sand or in the dirt as you were talking to them, and if the guy was a believer, he'd make another arc and make a fish out of it. And then you felt free to invite him to your fellowship. And so it may get to the point where there are things like that going on. That's what happens in China. And so I can see that. But at this point, I just want to be a guy who's using it to further the gospel, and that's something that's actually happening. And again, as soon as I see an attitude, where these Christians just need to shut it down, then we're going to open it up. So.
I just went through the Titus and then going into 2 Timothy. One of the things, and 1 Timothy too, but one of the things Paul says about in his direction towards obeying authorities and rulers of government was specifically, number one, to not harness the gospel, and then number two, to try and avoid persecution as much as possible. Right. And of course, this is under the time of Nero. Right. And so the third part of that, or the end part of that, is exactly what you said, where Paul's in prison and he's condemning, he's naming names of guys that are ashamed to come visit him. Right. And they were ashamed because if you go and visit Paul in prison during Rome time, right, you were marking that fish openly, right, saying, exactly, I'm a believer. And he says, you do not be ashamed of the gospel. Right. But all those things fit. Yeah. And so I'm with you, man. I'm like, they're like, stay at home. I'm like, nope. Yep. I'm going. I don't know where I'm going for a drive. I don't know where I'm going. But for the sake of the gospel, I can be peaceable. Right. But as soon as they turn that switch, then it's game on. Yeah. So. Exactly. So hopefully it's not going to go there, but get ready for game on.